Okay, here we go. Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the fourth session in a webinar series designed to advance climate change adaptation in protected areas through the exchange of information between practitioners in Eastern and Southern Africa and abroad with staff and colleagues of the U.S. National Park Service Climate Change Response Program. My name is Melanie Wood. I am with the Climate Change Response Program based in Fort Collins, Colorado, and I welcome you to the session today. Before we get started, I'll let you know this webinar is recorded and it will be made available to you later by email. I'd like to ask you to please mute your audio under the microphone icon on your Zoom control panel when you're not speaking. We'd love to hear from you, however, in our session today, and you can do that through features like the chat box. So I encourage you to take the time now to find and open your chat box. You can ask questions or make comments as you wish throughout the session today, and I will be asking you questions as well. So be ready to respond. If you're having issues with your audio or internet connectivity, you can chat your hosts directly by clicking on the chat. Find the three little dots to the right of your message box and select hosts and co-hosts, and one of us will try to help resolve the issue. We are honored to have 2 presentations and 3 speakers today, so we will hold most questions until the end, but again, I invite you to post those questions and comments in the chat throughout the presentations, and this will really encourage some active engagement throughout the session. We have several co-hosts in this series, and a couple that are helping to kick off our series today is Suzanne, Regional Environment Science and Technology Officer, South Africa Hub, based at the U.S. Embassy in Gaborone, and Joel, Climate Science and Adaptation Coordinator with the U.S. National Park Service Climate Change Response Program based in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'll turn it over to Suzanne, who's on audio, and Joel, who's on the webcam, to introduce this series, and then we'll get started.
Great, thanks, Melanie. Hello, everybody from Gaborone, Botswana. Apologies for not being on camera, but I really just wanted to take a moment to welcome you to this webinar. You know, I usually get some surprising looks when I talk about the opportunities for the United States and Africa to share their experiences in park management. You know, people think, what does the US and Africa have in common? But we actually do have a lot in common. I mean, when you look at the conservation areas of Eastern and Southern Africa and how they're highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, given the changes in rainfall and temperature patterns, how they already contribute to desertification, reduced availability of surface water and food sources for wildlife and people, stressed ecosystems, and increased human-wildlife conflict. Well, we're dealing with a lot of the same thing in the United States, and we really do share similar climate change driven vulnerabilities. So it makes sense to bring experts from both our regions, the United States and Africa, together to share best practices, exchange ideas, and develop networks that can continue to help in the management. So where do we all come in? So I'm with the U.S. Department of State based at our embassy, and we have a Embassy Science Fellows Climate Change Rapid Response Program that we're supporting. So this program targets you, the managers, the practitioners, and the scientists in protected areas within Eastern and Southern Africa with similar staff in the United States Park Service in their climate change response program to foster an information exchange, as Melanie said, on priority issues, tools and methods, including sharing the approaches used by the National Park Service to advance climate change and adaptation. So we really do hope that following this virtual information exchange, that you as participants and your countries and your organizations can continue to engage with each other and our U.S. offices to build the capacity to understand and communicate on these climate change vulnerability assessments, adaptation planning tools, and other more targeted climate change related topics across the region. And, you know, I say this really to underline that our government, the Biden-Harris administration, is committed to bolstering adaptation efforts that increase our resilience to the impacts of climate change, both in the United States and abroad. We realize that the ultimate magnitude and really the seriousness of climate impacts on people and nature are going to depend in part on the adaptation actions we take now. Adaptation actions have been shown to be effective at reducing risk and harm, but unfortunately, implementation of these adaptation measures have been too fragmented and small scale. So that's what makes today's discussion really relevant. We're so excited to be talking about developing frameworks for climate change adaptation and protected area management. We hope this session will introduce case studies to build resilience in Africa and African protected areas, and then explore ways to strategically manage the change using the Resist, Accept, Direct framework used in the US national parks. So huge thank you to the National Park Service for supporting this series of seminars for our regions. We couldn't have done it without you. While it would be great, of course, to meet in person, we do hope this virtual series will provide accessible and useful information to all of you and your colleagues. Back to you, Melanie.
Okay, thank you. And Joel?
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining, or good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Just a reminder that this is the fourth presentation in this series. I think our current schedule goes into January of 23. Just a reminder that we have a break in July. The next presentation in June will be on restoration and climate change. If you are interested in speaking or have colleagues that are interested in speaking on any of these topics, please send me an email. I'll also be reaching out to individuals here to line up the fall roster of speakers. With that, I want to introduce actually, I'll pass it back to Melanie before I introduce people.
Okay, great. So, but yes, before we introduce our speakers, we'd like to introduce each other. So there are a lot of people here today. We don't have time to verbally introduce everyone, but I would encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat. So I'm going to start by typing my name, position title, organization, country you're joining us from, however you'd like to introduce yourself. There I am, Melanie Wood in the chat. Please go ahead and introduce yourself as well. Another way that we like to get to know each other, because really what we'd like to do here is build this community of practice where we can exchange information, is to see who's on the call through polling features. And so I'd like you to sit up a little straighter and lean forward, grab your mouse, and I'm going to go ahead and launch a couple of questions. The first one is very basic. What's the best description of your organization relative to the management of protected areas or landscapes? And you've got some choices here. TFCA, National Park, or the protected area? Are you a non-US federal agency, provincial or district kind of agency? Are you from academia, nonprofit, other stakeholder organization, US government, student? Hopefully you fall into one of those categories and folks are answering very quickly. So I will give this a couple more seconds. Wow. Really coming in fast. Okay. All right, 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end this poll and let's see who's here today. All right, looks like we've got a pretty good distribution of folks here. And thank you for entering your names in the chat. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see your names here. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing that one. I've got another question for you. And that is about your interest in this series. The most important thing I'd like to learn in this series is what other people are doing, discovering new tools, potential new partnerships, fill gaps in my organization's knowledge, how to prioritize my next action. Thank you for entering those. I'll give it a couple more seconds here. And ending the poll. Okay, looks like the majority are here to learn what other organizations are doing. So that is really great. Welcome. Thank you. I've got one more. And this is sort of a selfish one. Joel and I would really like to know, what topics are you most interested in this series? And a few of the options here are subjects that we've already covered to some extent, and we could go in further detail. So if you're interested in learning more about our January, February, and March sessions, that will be in the follow-up email after this webinar. So vulnerability assessments, adaptation frameworks, which is the subject for today's talk. Restoration, that's next month. Scenario planning, transboundary conservation, climate change communication, and community-based conservation. This is a multiple choice, so you got to pick. All right, I'm going to end this poll and share the results. Might be a little bit of a response bias here, where adaptation frameworks is the winner and you have selected to be on this session specifically to learn about that topic, but it looks like a pretty good distribution otherwise. So thank you so much for doing that. Really helps us feel like we're not just talking to you, but we're able to interact together, which is very helpful. Okay, so let's get started. Joel, I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce our speakers, and here we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you everybody for sharing a little information about yourselves so we get to know each other a bit more. As we begin the main presentations, I'd like to remind everybody to please mute your audio if you haven't already done so. And please feel free to raise questions for the speakers in the chat. We'll compile those and address them at the end of both talks during the discussion period. So again, please don't refrain and just hang on and we'll get to your questions at the end. So our first presentation is on vulnerability frameworks for climate change for protected and conserved areas in Africa. Cases of marine and terrestrial protected areas. Are excited to introduce two speakers today. Harisoa Rakotondrazafy. Harisoa is Africa Climate Change Adaptation Coordinator for the World Wildlife Fund. She's based in Madagascar and has worked on climate change adaptation for over a decade, ranging from practice to policy level. She has practical experiences in mainstreaming climate change adaptation into conservation work, ranging from capacity building, vulnerability assessments, and implementation of adaptation measures, including efforts involving protected areas. She's going to be joined today by her colleague, Kevin Codrey, who's a climate change researcher in South Africa. He uses his experience in socioeconomic and ecosystem service modeling for vulnerability assessments and econometric and spatial analysis to assist governments and NGOs with developing appropriate adaptation and mitigation responses. Kevin also works in modeling cost-benefit analysis and financial modeling for nature-based solutions. And so with that, I will pass it over to Harisoa if you want to begin sharing your slides.
Thanks so much, Joel. And maybe first of all, thank you for the invitation for participating in this interesting webinar. And as already introduced, we are going to talk today about our vulnerability framework for climate change adaptation for protected area and conserved areas. That will be done by myself and Kelvin as introduced. So maybe I would like to start with talking a bit about Africa. And I think that all of us know that Africa is among the most vulnerable continent in the world. And we hope that in the next decade, maybe the trend will be reversed, that Africa could be one of the most resilient. But it needs really more actions from that. And by saying that the most vulnerable continent, I mean that there are already many obvious cases where climate change is already affecting our biodiversity, our people, our economy. So just mentioning, for example, the recent drought that was affecting the southern part of Madagascar, which I think that led to famine, led to conflict, led to biodiversity loss. Same in the other part of Africa, like the cyclones that were hitting Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe. with many loss of lives as well, and having impact on biodiversity. I think that one thing that I would like to highlight today is really the recent IPCC report that was released in February this year. So something that might scare in us, but I would say that what will happen if we are going if the temperature will increase above 1.5 degrees is something that we are currently trying to keep, and where we are already at 1.1 degrees Celsius. So just as we are talking about protected areas, just highlighting a few figures from this report, that if you are going to be above 1.5, you are going to lose over 30% of our Africa populations in terms of species, as well as their suitable habitat, as well as around between 7 to 18% of species in Africa as well. In terms of fisheries that many people in Africa are depending on, we are going to lose as well up to 40% in Africa as well, leaving close to 300 million of people at risk of malnutrition. And same on agriculture, same on migration, something that is already happening even before climate change, but now it's quite exacerbating by climate change, where people is moving from their homeland, finding other resources, and same with sea level rise. So I would say that this is what will happen, and not yet now, but if you're not going to take the right, I would say, actions, something that we will deal in the next future. And where I would say that protected areas will really have a role to address that. And something that we are going to talk today is really regarding protected areas, and maybe in related to adaptation, we see protected areas playing a double role. One is that adaptation for protected areas, so meaning that all of the actions that will help really to increase the resilience of protected areas to current and future climate change. And one is really looking at protected areas for adaptation, really to seek how protected areas could play really a part of a global strategy to address climate change. And just coming back a bit regarding all of the threats that I have mentioned above, something that is clear that during many decades, we are used to work in a, I would say, stationary climate, where our work was focused in repairing damaged places or preserving undamaged places. And what we do in restoration, in managing our ecosystem, in managing our species, trying really to make sure that we will be able to get back in the original, I would say, state of the ecosystem of the species. But something obvious right now with the dynamic climate, given that the climate has changed, it's no longer, in some ways, it's no longer possible to make sure that we are maintaining the same state of ecosystem or species, but more how we can really maintain the function of ecosystem, knowing that there are many changes that will happen in terms of the ecosystem population, like migration, dispersion, and so on. So something that is key for us as protected area manager, we need really to move from managing for persistence and really moving for managing for change. And I think this is something that needs really to be embedded in all of the management of protected areas. So what I'm going to talk based on that, we had an opportunity in the last, I would say starting in 2011, to pilot an adaptation project that really try to learn from how we are going really to address climate change in our work. And this project was funded by the European Union, and with the involvement of many partners that is cited below. And the idea behind that is really, as the target was 6 marine protected areas within 3 countries, Colombia, Madagascar, and the Philippines. And the idea behind that is really how we can really establish a strong framework from marine protected area managers that will help them really to see how to understand better the impact of climate change on the protected areas, I would say conservation target and people living around, and what kind of adaptation option could be implemented that will fit as well with the needs of the marine protected areas. And one of the big components as well is really making sure that we are like mainstreaming climate change as part of the whole protected area management framework. So we developed this tool, the tool named Climate Adaptation Methodology for Protected Area, or CAMPA, in this I would say in this objective, really helping the protected area manager. So this tool, I would say that our idea behind in developing that is to be a flexible framework, and as well as based on existing approaches, not always reinventing the wheel, but what we can use from existing approaches first and bring in some innovation, and based as well on more field tested work. And the methodology, I would say, include 8 main steps. And starting, I'm maybe not going to go in detail on that, but really looking at what really the objective of the vulnerability assessment, what is the scope, and something to understand as well is what is the non-climate and climate scenarios, because we are not, as working on climate change, we are not only focusing on climate change, I would say climate risk, but we need also to understand the interaction with existing threats like human threats. And the methodology gives 2 options. One first option is really if you want to do a rapid vulnerability assessment. And there is already some, I would say, guidance. I will talk more on that in the next slide. And another choice is really if you want to go in detail. So going in detail means really choosing like specific framework that will target specific, I would say, targets like coral reef or mangroves or forests, depending on your target in the protected areas. And moving from that, really looking at what kind of adaptation measure could be prioritized and implemented. And as part of the final aim is making sure that the result of all of this will help really to update the management plan of the protected areas. And in moving, this is just to show this rapid vulnerability assessment sheet. So there are a lot of sheets on that based really on what is available in the literature, in the expert knowledge, and if there is any studies. So we can start from that, not really waiting that we have a perfect information, but we can combine many approaches on that. And just maybe some highlights on that tools. So I would say that the two main protected areas, I'm talking more to Madagascar because it's related to Africa, is we were able really to mainstream the climate change consideration in 2 first northern marine protected areas in Madagascar, namely Nusiar National Park and the Ambudvaibe marine protected area. So it was a long process because it was like a 4-year project, and covering really, starting as at that time, climate change was quite new domain for many people. And I would say that after 10 years now, the knowledge is increasing, and we have many options. But at that time, I would say that many organizations have started to work on climate change. So capacity building was really one key element for us. And also using this approach of multi-expert vulnerability assessment, where we brought on board many organizations that have the capacity, that have the expertise on the I would say, the key targets. For example, in this area, we've done like, I would say 6 vulnerability assessment targeting fisheries, coral reefs, mangroves, communities, birds, as well as to understand the climate information. And based on that, we were able to implement some key adaptation measures in the 2 projected areas, including some monitoring system. As at that time, I would say in terms of climate information, the existing, I would say, climate devices that are available throughout the country were still limited, and we still need some downscaled information. So the reason that we have invested as well in some weather station that will help really to track what happened at the local level. And from these 2 cases, we will say that I can say that because in Madagascar we have this kind of protected areas network, more than 122 now, and these experiences from these MPAs were used really as a model to, I would say, to advocate the needs of considering climate change within this network framework that will be used with all of the protected areas within the country. And we've started as well to spread the knowledge. And we've done really so far, we've done to build the capacity and adapting this methodology that was mainly for marine protected areas as the first aim. But we've used as well to the terrestrial protected areas. So at the end, so far, we've been able really to train around 65 people covering 85 protected areas in Madagascar, like covering 83% of terrestrial peers in the country, as well as MPA manager. So I will stop there for that, and maybe just introducing where Kevin as well is going to talk more. So between 2018 and 2020, with the support of NORAD, WWF has commissioned I would say series of vulnerability assessments targeting 263 protected areas in Africa. And it was done in collaboration with Encore Environmental Consultant, where Kevin at that time was part of. And the framework that is going to share with us is because we based this vulnerability assessment on the framework that was developed by Kevin and team. So the next slide, we are going really to know more about what we have done as well at the Africa level, and more focusing on the terrestrial protected areas. So over to you, Kevin.
Thanks very much, Harisoa. Do you mind just going back one slide, and I will start. Fantastic. So good day, everyone. Nice to see some familiar names in the participant list. Right, so together with Wendy Foden, who is actually on this call as well, and Jane Turpey, we have developed a framework for assessing the vulnerability of protected areas to climate change. And we are very excited and proud to say that it will be published in the Conservation Biology Journal within the next couple of months. And this has been in the works probably for the last 4 or 5 years. So it's great to have got it over the line, and we're looking forward to that. So the framework draws on the IPCC's definition of vulnerability, which is a function of a system's sensitivity to climate threats and the capacity of the system to adapt to these threats. It is an indicator-based vulnerability assessment. And what makes this useful is that even without very location-specific detailed data, even protected area managers can use global data sets to identify the key vulnerabilities within their protected areas, as well as ranking protected areas. So, as I say, the framework is useful at both the protected area level as well as the network level. And at the protected area level, so it allows for the key vulnerabilities to be identified. And at the network level, it allows for the most vulnerable protected areas to be identified, which assists with resource allocation. Right, next slide, please, Harrison. So this is the infographic that we commissioned for this paper that is getting published now. And it essentially explains what's gone into this framework. So the framework considers a protected area's potential climate impacts to be a function of species change, habitat change, and resource pressure change as a result of change in climate. While the protected area's capacity to adapt is seen as a function of a protected area's management effectiveness, adjacent land use, and financial resilience. Financial resilience is in turn a function of a protected area's tourism resilience and infrastructure resilience, which are both subject to changes in climate. For infrastructure, these changes in climate experienced through the impact of extreme weather events such as flooding and storm surges. And for the impact on tourism, these changes are seen through changes in key attractions, tourist comfort levels, disease risk, and viewing experience. Unfortunately, we don't have time to really unpack each of these. I mean, a lot has gone into them. It's also, protected area managers can also choose what indicators they would like to use for each of those components. So, for example, for species change, we could look at species loss or a number of other measures in that sense. Okay, next slide, please, Harisoa. So to date, the framework has been applied to over 1,500 protected areas globally. This has largely been through the work that I've done with WWF as well as Conservation International. But for WWF, we've applied the framework to 263 protected and conserved areas across sub-Saharan Africa, specifically within the Tridom landscape in West Africa, the Khaza landscape in Southern Africa, the Soknot landscape in Eastern Africa, and the Greater Virunga landscape in Central Africa. It was also applied to communal conservancies in Namibia and protected areas within Madagascar. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to provide some very high-level results. There's obviously not enough time to go into the level of detail that you can glean from this assessment at a protected area level. So this is really looking at the summary across these 263 protected and conserved areas. So the potential climate impacts, which is the mean of the species change, habitat change, and resource pressure change components, were high for most protected and conserved areas, with the highest scores being registered for protected areas in Kenya and Tanzania. Interestingly, for 7 of the protected areas assessed, more than 50% of the animal and plant species considered are expected to no longer find the protected area climatically suitable by 2050. And for a further 10 protected areas that were assessed, more than 50% of the protected and conserved biomes are expected to be altered by negatively by 2050. So these results are largely based on models and data sets developed under the SPARK project, which was led by Conservation International. And I think there are quite a number of participants on the call today that were involved in that project. Okay, next slide, please, Harrison. The capacity of protected areas to adapt to climate change, and in this instance, the capacity to adapt is the mean of the management effectiveness, adjacent land use, and financial resilience components. The scores were high for most protected and conserved areas, with the lowest scores being registered for communal conservancies in Namibia, and then protected areas in the DRC and Rwanda. All right. Next slide, please, Harisoa. And then finally, combining the potential impacts component with the adaptive capacity component, we get to an overall vulnerability score. And these scores were high, with only 1.5% of the protected areas assessed considered to be resilient to climate change, while 57% were considered to be highly vulnerable. From a country perspective, protected areas within Kenya had the highest mean vulnerability scores, followed by Namibia, while protected areas within Gabon and the Congo had the lowest mean vulnerability scores. And finally, last slide, please, Harisoa. Harisoa? Oh, okay. So in terms of what we took out of these studies, we obviously looked for recommendations in terms of adaptation and building resilience. And we actually opted to err on the side of caution and speak more to building resilience than applying specific adaptation responses. And the reason for this is that it limits the potential for maladaptation and provides species and ecosystems the opportunity to adapt and evolve to climate change in their own way. So, the overarching recommendations include protecting and rehabilitating areas identified as important refuges for species, restoring, creating, and facilitating wildlife dispersal areas and movement corridors, developing dynamic transboundary strategies and plans to ensure joint management of climate impacts on biodiversity and people, strengthening local and transboundary monitoring of climate, species, and ecosystem interactions, and assisting communities with diversifying into climate-compatible livelihoods and or climate-proofing their existing livelihoods. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to continue with the remaining slides. So as based on this assessment that WWF has done with the support of Kevin and team, currently we are now working on the next steps, because that's something that sometimes we, in general, that people are starting with vulnerability assessment and somewhere stuck with what next. So we need really to see how we can really transform all of these results really to implementation. And as you see from the presentation, it's more the result are more indicating what will happen in the future. And I think that it gives really an opportunity for us to see how we can limit all of this, I would say, biodiversity, species loss, habitat loss, and the impact on the communities, and where we need to act now. And I think that this is something that we are going to work really in partnership with many organizations as well. And the reason that just talking about the, I would say, key event that will take place soon, I would say some of the overall key messages on VF framework. As said, I think by Susan in the beginning, we cannot say that we are working on adaptation to climate change if you are not doing any vulnerability risk assessment. So it's quite a foundation, really, on a foundation of any work related to climate change adaptation, and even if you are going to incorporate that into our protected area management. Because many people now are talking about, we are really working on adaptation, but at the end, when we are asking them in what is the basis of your adaptation work, so sometimes it's like the business usual work that they are doing. And something key as well is that we know that there are a lot of frameworks now. And but something that based on our experience, we just need to start with what works best for us, and not be stuck as well with any data gaps, as we cannot be perfect in the data we need, as well as capacity. But I think that there are, I would say, a simple framework that can be used, And particularly, for example, if I'm mentioning the one that using the community knowledge, that is quite valuable as well, because they are living around the nature. They know better what's happened to their livelihood. So we can start with what we have, with the resources that we have in terms of human, in terms of finance, and so on. And something that I said in the beginning is that we need to make sure that our vulnerability assessment work leads to implementation, not stop there. And I think that there is no end. We need really to update even the vulnerability assessment, update the adaptation measure that we are implementing, revisiting our goals, our strategy, as climate is really quickly changing, and we have to be on track with that. And I said from the beginning of my presentation, in working on protected areas management in a changing climate, we need really to manage for change and not for persistence. And something that I would like to take the opportunity to be here to talk about an upcoming important event for Africa. So the Africa Protected Area Congress. And it's quite important. Why? Because it's the first ever continent-wide congress that gathering African leaders, citizen, interest group, and so on, with the objective of discussing the role of protected areas in conserving nature, safeguarding Africa's iconic wildlife, delivering a vital life, supporting ecosystem services, and promoting sustainable development. And this Congress will take place, it has been postponed many times due to the COVID issue, all of us know, but now we hope that it will take place now in July, between 18 to 23rd July in Kigali, Rwanda. And this Congress is convened by the government of Rwanda, has been in Rwanda, as well as the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and Africa Wildlife Foundation, with the support of many organizations. I think part of us are here in this call. And just to say that this Congress is quite important. And just to summarize a bit, the main objective is really to support African leadership and commitment to implement nature and societal aspiration, to promote actions that value the role of protected and conserved areas, to identify underlying drivers of biodiversity loss and seek to address them for sure, to agree and deliver practical measures to enhance effective governance of protected and conserved area, to strengthen measures to uphold rights and responsibility of indigenous people, local communities, and youth, and to develop and agree on effective platform to advocate for protected and conserved areas. And at the end, really to launch an effective Pan-African networks, partnership, cooperation, and so on. But moving to climate change, the reason of this presentation. So maybe I forgot to mention in the beginning that this Congress is quite focusing on three mainstreams: protected and conserved areas, biodiversity, and people, which are supported by cross-cutting teams where climate change is part of. And when moving to climate change is one of the cross-cutting teams that will be highlighted during the Congress, and where myself is leading for the Congress with a support team including Kevin and others. And I would say the objective we put together as part of the main objective of the climate change section is really an opportunity for us to consolidate scientific traditional knowledge and best practices regarding the nexus between protected and conserved areas, biodiversity, people, and climate change, to demonstrate as well the role of protected areas as nature-based solution, as indicated in the former slides, that as a global strategy to address climate change through adaptation and mitigation actions. to boost as well the contribution of protected areas for climate at subnational, national, and regional level, and also better positioning the nexus between protected areas and climate change in the global agenda. Could be the CBD, the UNFCCC, UNCCD, and SDG, and to promote an Africa think around protected area and climate change from existing platform and network, and with gathering several stakeholders from government, CSO, youth, and so on. The idea is really to make a united multi-government statement about the key role of PAs on climate change and mitigation, and to use that as well to start this Pan-African fintech. So just to summarize that during this session, we will have 3 main sessions that will focus, one will focus really on the protected and conserved areas we want in Africa under a changing climate. One is looking at the impact of climate change on biodiversity and the paradigm shift really to manage for change. And one is looking at the interaction between climate change on people and protected areas. So this upcoming event, I would say, is really key to see some transformation on how protected areas really could play a role and have really and better positioned regarding what's happening now with climate threats and so on. So something that's really key for us, Africa, to push forward. And my last slide is really about what we plan to deliver as part of this Congress on the climate change issue, maybe not covering all of the needs, but at least to adopt this Pan-African strategy on climate change and protected areas that will help us to guide and to drive transformational knowledge solution, effective policy and sustainable finance in Africa, which will be supported the Pan-African think tank, and the commitment as well from the government to really upgrade the role of protected areas as an nature-based solution. So I'm not sure how far, but I see many Africa stakeholders here as well. You are aware about that, but this is quite important for us, Africa, as well as beyond. And if in the case you need any information regarding all of the presentation and this event and climate change cross-cutting team, please feel free to reach me and the team as well. So thank you very much, colleagues, and happy to receive any question from you. So over to you, Joel.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Harisoa and Kevin. And remind people to please, there's a couple questions and requests in the chat. Please go ahead and keep adding that, and we'll come back to those to address those after the next speaker. So I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Gregor Schuurman. Gregor, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your slides while I'm doing that, that'd be great. Gregor is South African who immigrated with his family to the US at the age of 8, then returned to South Africa to spend his 20s studying termite influence on savanna ecosystem function in the Okavango Delta. After completing his dissertation in the early 2000s, Gregor shifted his focus to understanding and addressing climate change impacts on ecosystems in the US, first in Hawaii, then in Wisconsin. Gregor joined the National Park Service's Climate Change Response Program about a decade ago, where he and his science and adaptation teammates help parks and partners understand and respond to climate change implications for diverse resources, facilities and operations, and visitor experience. And thank you, Gregor, for joining today, and I'll pass it to you.
Just unmuting myself really quickly. Sorry about that. Going to set up my presentation again. Just checking that you can hear me. Everything's working.
All sounds and looks good.
Great. Thanks very much, Joel. And thanks to Melanie for organizing this series of webinars. And thanks to Kevin and Harisoa for a really great presentation that resonates with what I'm about to talk about. So I think these two fit really, really well together. And I'm impressed at sort of the thinking about vulnerability there in recognition of climate non-stationarity, the topic of a paradigm shift, and the need to manage for change and not just for persistence. And so what I'm going to be talking about is the resist, accept, direct framework. You can see the graphic in the bottom left representing it, sort of 3 choices managers can make in the face of strong human-driven trajectories in ecological systems. And this framework of ours was featured in a journal, a set of 5 articles in Bioscience. That's on the bottom right here earlier this year, and I'll mention that series or that series of papers as I talk through this, because there's some good, deeper information for folks to look at, and I'll also be sharing some other links. I'm going to just jump right in and just acknowledge that what I'm trying to do here is share a little more of the how. You've heard from Kevin and Harisoa about the need to manage for change and not just for persistence, but what does that mean and how do we do that? So a first point I want to make is just a reminder, we all know this, that climate change is not the only important human-driven driver of ecological change. We've got habitat loss, fragmentation, invasive species, pollution, overharvest, etc. But we're all talking about climate change because it's a massive force, because it's pervasive, because it's new, and it's sort of slightly different. Yes, often it's just degradative, but as you've heard from Harisoa and Kevin, there's also these possibilities of shifts in the ecological potential in one place, and this idea of climate and biodiversity non-stationarity. So it has its own challenges because it can literally change the ecological potential of a place. And so the guides shown on the left-hand side of this slide are documents that we, the U.S. National Park Service, has put out in the last couple of years that are starting to reckon with this reality and starting to help us or try to help us all plan for a changing climate more effectively, maybe than the way we were thinking a decade ago. On the right, we've got a couple of articles from the media in the past year or two, again, sort of testifying to societal recognition of the challenges we're facing and the limits of managing for persistence and the need to think more broadly. So just by contrast of kind of the world we're in, this is the world many of us thought we lived in when we were younger, especially those of us who aren't so young. We call this a 20th century perspective. And what I'm showing here in this graph at the top is a driver of ecological condition, experienced weather, and in this case, I've picked temperature. And what you see is it operates within a familiar band that I've made light blue here, and I call this our stationarity bound. And it's the idea that things are not static, but that they operate within bounds like high tide to low tide that we can work around, predict, and understand, and use terms like historical or natural range of variability. And below in this graph, what I'm showing is ecological condition representing 2 ecosystems with different levels of sensitivity to that ecological driver of experienced weather, but both of them having some kind of response. So just to give a sense that systems are diverse in how responsive they are. Of course, this is what we're living in now, a non-stationary world. And you heard Harisoa talk a little bit about climate non-stationarity. This is an expression of it. Instead of having a mean with reliable variation around it, what we've got is a trend. And initially, you see a heat event here in the middle circled in orange, and then a bit of a heat wave with that orange box. And eventually at the far right, we get climate departure when the entire new range is outside of the historical range. And this idea that things are changing and that the drivers of ecological condition and the sort of key aspects of climate are entering new regimes is increasingly being recognized by society and the media. So I just Googled climate change and here to stay. And this is what I found. Extreme heat is recognized as being here to stay. Drought is being recognized as here to stay. These are all US examples. Flooding is here to stay. Warmer winters, here to stay. And record-setting high tide floods on our coasts and all the associated impacts are here to stay. Now, ecosystems can change in various ways, as I suggested, in response to these trends. The orange line shows a system faithfully tracking that change. And the blue and purple lines below show systems that have internal resilience or are maybe waiting for a stochastic triggering event, and then they'll undergo abrupt ecological change. Ultimately, when we get enough change in species composition in a system, we start to get changes in structure and function, in ecosystem services, and increasingly this term of ecological transformation is being used in the literature. When we look to the past, as Nolan et al. Did a few years ago, we recognized that in historical periods when climate change was rapid, ecological transformations have been pervasive, both in terms of composition and in terms of ecosystem structure. And as we look to the future, particularly under assumptions of higher emissions, we see the prospects for transformation in terms of composition and structure are also quite high. Here's an analysis quickly of done on bird assemblages in US national parks in collaboration with National Audubon. And what it showed is under assumptions of higher emissions, we can expect almost a 25% turnover in our bird assemblages in the average park within the next few decades. And just one quick one I won't delve into that's looked at this and reports that there's already, where we have the data available, there's already quite a high degree of turnover in ecological communities. The statistic here is 28% per decade, which to me seems high. I need to dig into this a bit more, but the point is change is already ongoing and being measured and observed. Here's an example of gradual change. This is the US East Coast, where slowly salt marshes are eating up upland forests, right? That conversion is happening, and this is fairly predictable on a decade-to-decade scale based on sea level rise. And here's an example of one of those abrupt ecological changes. This was a heat dome in the northwest side of the North American continent about a year ago that, as this article says, probably killed 1 billion marine animals and likely set off all kinds of changes in some of these systems, given changes in marine conditions already occurring due to climate change. Here's an example also of another one of those abrupt ecological changes. This is a system that looks a lot like the quiver tree system in southwestern Africa. And here we had another one of those triggering events, a fire that caused a major transformation. Closer to where many of us are speaking from or listening from in the center of North America in our subalpine forests, we're seeing a whole different fire regime than we've seen in millennia. And this is a figure that illustrates that I've superimposed this blue stationarity band there, showing 2 millennia of historical or natural range of variability with the climate information above. You can start to see a bit of a relationship there. And in the past few decades, this is what non-stationarity looks like. Fire return intervals and temperatures are completely outside of historical ranges of variability. And this is leading to things like this. These are giant sequoias that live for thousands of years, and we don't normally see adults on fire. These are fire adapted species, but not for the fire conditions that they're now experiencing. And this is necessitating these kinds of resistance activities just to try to keep a many thousand-year-old tree just to help it persist where it has persisted for so long. And so this reality challenges a historical natural resource paradigm that many of us operate within, which, as the quote here below from less than a quarter century ago says, managing an ecosystem within its range of variability is an appropriate way to basically conserve successfully. There's our stationarity band, and there's how we know when we're doing this. We're trying to approximate ecological conditions that are unaffected by people. And here we mean sort of modern post-industrial society. In our national refuge system in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we use historic or historical conditions. The idea is to prevent or reverse impacts. In the National Park Service, we focus on natural as our key term. But when you go to the definition, it gets back to this idea of an absence of human dominance over the landscape, which we understand in a climate change context is harder and harder to apply. And so we need to face this challenge to our paradigm to be effective stewards, because things are changing and managers face unavoidable choices. And I want to illustrate this with the reality experienced by a couple of our colleagues up in the high latitudes of Alaska. This is John Morton and Dawn Magnus, who many of us have worked with for a few years on these challenges. And they and colleagues manage a very large multi-million hectare area in South Central Alaska that sits climatically at the boundary between boreal forest, temperate forest, and grassland and savanna, and has been trending away from the boreal forest climate space, kind of walking that knife edge between forest and savanna. What this means is that when their spruce forest gets taken out by typically a combination of fire, beetles, and drought, all intensified by warming, they don't get a forest at all afterwards. They get a grassland with one species, blue joint. And so recognizing that this is a change driven ultimately by modern human activities, the natural traditional conservation response is, can the change be reversed or resisted? And here, John and Dawn and colleagues, they think about the scale visible from space. They think about the directionality of climate change. They put in some ecological uncertainty and they're really not sure about that. So then they move on and they ask, well, what happens if we accept this trajectory? Where is this system headed? Is this novel depauperate grassland the endpoint, or what's happening? And we don't really know this. So there's some important science needs here to support this kind of management and potentially inform this decision. But then they ask a third question, and this is part of reckoning with climate non-stationarity, is can we try to direct this trajectory or at least avoid least desirable outcomes? And there's a recognition that as time goes on, those opportunities diminish. And here are some of those opportunities. There's a lot of managed relocation or intervention being contemplated, and this isn't an academic exercise here. There are neighbors and partners who are beginning to engage in some of these activities. So for John and Dawn and colleagues, this question of what a manager is to do, like I say, is not an academic or idle question. It's really pressing. And they can look to guides like these, a North American version on the left, an international version on the right, and they can read this mantra, manage for change, not just for persistence, and some really good text that supports it, but it doesn't really get all the way to how. How do we do this? And that's the challenge that we have faced in the past few years, how to help managers make these unavoidable choices strategically rather than simply exercise the impulses of traditional conservation, which may be confining or anachronistic. So we recognize that managers see these challenges, but when they look for help, what they often see is an overwhelming set of options and frameworks and concepts. And this is consistent with paradigm shift because everybody recognizes their new challenges and everybody's trying to build their own way to meet them. So when we look to how different groups have tried to split up, manage for persistence versus change, to make it operational, there's lots of different schemes, lots of different typologies. And we, in trying to work with our parks and partners, recognized that among all of this, what we needed was a manager-centered framework that was as simple and intuitive as possible. And so we looked up among this thicket of past work and we chose an oldie but a goodie, Resist Accept Guide, which had been published out in 2008 and 2010 by some real leaders in early climate change adaptation, recognizing the limits, excuse me, of our historical paradigm and the need to think. So we brought this scheme down. We toyed around with the terms a little bit, and in particular, we expanded guide to direct because we wanted to give a clear sense that intervention in this on this end could be quite forceful at times. And we brought this framework into some work with parks on the left in scenario-based adaptation work, and we also worked it into our Coastal Adaptation Strategies Handbook about a half dozen years ago. So those are early experiments in all of this. And then we built on a decade of this thinking in a couple of groups that formed in the last handful of years, and those are at the bottom here, and I'll talk about one of them in a minute. And we sort of settled on Resist, Accept, Direct as our three-part framework. One of these groups is called the Federal Navigating Ecological Transformation Working Group. So the focus is this challenge of strong trajectories driven by climate change, and a recognition that among the diverse agencies and bureaus shown here, we didn't have guidance that anticipated these circumstances, rapid directional transformative ecological change, and that, you know, recognizing that we're all different in how we fit into the overall system, there's still a need to develop a shared-based framework, science-based framework from which management entities could derive their agency-specific guidance. So that is the Resist, Accept, Direct framework as the heart of our thinking here. The definitions are presented here with resist essentially being traditional conservation. Acceptance is the intentional choice to allow things to change autonomously. And then directing, of course, is actively shaping this change. And it's a very simple framework, but what we found is it's really helpful. And we consider all three choices here to be adaptation if one has gone through the thinking process and can show one's work. And just a wrinkle on acceptance that sometimes that can simply involve making no changes to management approaches. The reason you're in a RAD conversation is they're insufficient to resist change. There's an alternative also just ceasing some of those historical approaches because maybe they no longer have a purpose. Okay, so this framework is useful, as I've said before, because it's focused on manager intent. These are 3 verbs. They're things managers will do. So it's focused again also on manager action. It's universal in encompassing the 3 options in a very simple framework that's neutral in terms of which option it presents, because context is everything. So we don't say resist first and then the other things, we say it depends. Framework empirically supports clear communication. We found it's intuitive and helps different stakeholders and managers work together. And it works across time and space. And one of the articles in that 5-paper bundle I'll get back to focuses a lot on the details of RAD application in that way. Another paper talks about linking RAD with adaptive management. And I'll talk more about some of the other ways that we think RAD works with adaptation tools. So I just want to sort of move toward wrapping up here by showing some illustrations of RAD framework application, and then I'll finish with sharing a few links where people can learn more. This is a refuge on the eastern US coast, one of those places where sea level rise is converting upland forest to salt marsh, and this is a management unit that's keenly aware of its climate change adaptation challenges and mission. And so they're supporting the natural ecosystem resilience processes through thin layer application that's helping their salt marsh keep up with sea level rise. This is a resistant action. But in the very same management unit, they're also engaged in directing change because they don't want to have any net loss of salt marsh. So they're actively removing trees to promote marsh expansion inland at the inland margin of the salt marsh. That's an illustration of 2 different options working together. Up the coast at Fire Island National Seashore, a hurricane-driven breach in a barrier island would typically be closed with an engineering solution involving heavy machinery, but in this case, the park has elected to accept change and allow this system to try to equilibrate with a new sea level and new forces at play. This is one that's been really encouraging because it's a park sort of picking up the RAD language and applying it without us being involved at all. And the example here is a species that historically occurred, say, a few hundred miles south of the park. And they've been fighting it as an invasive for a long time. And now there's a recognition of climate non-stationarity, biotic non-stationarity. And in answer to this question, in a recent publication came out a few weeks ago, are protected areas, are they still useful in the context of shifting climates and species range shift? And Chris's answer here is, yeah, climate tracking species are not invasive. They're going to welcome species from nearby that seemingly are expanding their range consistent with climate change. Of course, we've looked at this example of resistance. Personally, I hope we're doing more than this because this seems a little desperate. So here's an example where I hope we're not investing completely in resistance. Here's an example from Glacier National Park of directing change. This is moving a native species upstream above a natural barrier or waterfall so that it can stay within waters it requires. This is a native trout. And also get away from non-natives that it was not really winning the competitive battle with. So this is an example of directing change in this part of the system for the broader purposes of biodiversity conservation in a changing world. A very similar example is a native community in northern Minnesota relying on the species on the left, brook trout, as a protein source, carefully managing a climate-related decline of that species. And when a trigger or a threshold is crossed, engaging in managed relocation of the species on the right to maintain the ecosystem service, but rely on different species to do so. If you want to learn more about the RAD framework, there are these 2 pubs with links shared earlier. But in terms of recent products, we came out in the Park Service with a RAD report in late 2020. It kind of delves into, obviously, the framework, introduces it for resource management, dwells somewhat on policy and things like that. So that's a good sort of within agency look at RAD. And we also brought RAD in to our guide that came out a year ago, Planning for a Changing Climate, which unifies it with climate smart principles and with scenario planning for climate change adaptation. So that's a good synthesis. You can also go to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Refuges and Climate Change page. Is just a really nice website that sort of brings this thinking in fairly deeply and broadly across their website. So I really appreciate appreciate that one as a good illustration of RAD communication. We've got a RAD page, and the link is down here, that's got a lot of resources, publications, etc. A lot of what I've been talking about. And it links also to the U.S. Geological Survey's RAD page, which has recorded RAD webinars and additional publications. I've mentioned several times the 5-paper bundle that came out earlier this year. The link at the bottom just takes you back to the NPS RAD page, but that's where you can find most of these articles still in open access. If anybody's particularly interested in the 5th one, you can reach out to me. That's not open access, and I can share it. With that, just thank you for your time, and excited if we have time to field any questions alongside Kevin and Harisoa.
Okay, I am honestly a little overwhelmed at the amount of resources and links that are being shared in the chat from Gregor and Harisoa. Thank you so much for sharing all of this information. It is really fantastic to be able to click on these links and look at some very accessible information and just so much of it. So thank you so much. I'm looking at a comment from Harisoa. Please include in the list of email. Oh yes, I will share all of these links. I'll create a whole separate Word document that you can go and investigate each of these resources separately as you're interested in them. We have some time for questions, so I really encourage you to please post comments, questions in the chat. You can also raise your hand and unmute yourself, and we can have just a little bit of a conversation here. I don't have any questions myself because there's so much information here. And so, hi, Joel. So yes, I'm just very overwhelmed at how much information is available. Oh, Joel is
I'm raising my hand in a very analog way. Yes. Hey, I had a question for Harisoa and Kevin. So you mentioned, well, first, thank you, all the speakers. Great presentation today. Really appreciate that. My question, a mention was made that with the WWF and Conservation International, with the framework that you guys have worked with about 1,000 different protected areas across the globe. But I'm wondering, has there been any effort to compile the adaptation strategies that were identified across each of those sessions? You mentioned some of the key ones. That you had a slide at the tail end on maybe 5 or 7 of the key take-homes, mainly built on enhancing resilience. But I'm just wondering if there were more location-specific strategies that came up, because it would be interesting to see commonalities across that.
Thanks, Joel. Maybe I will leave to Kevin first to talk about because ours was quite focusing on WWF, but what he's talking is really broad. And then I will come back to the WWF side. So over to you, Kevin.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question, Joel. So each of the areas that we applied the framework to for WWF and for Conservation International. So it was, broken up into different regions and landscapes and so on. Each of those had some very specific recommendations and guidelines in terms of what we think would add value there in terms of building resilience and potentially adaptation actions as well. But to answer your question, there hasn't been any focus on compiling a report that brings them all together, and I think it's a really interesting opportunity to do that. I think, it's something that can be looked at. I am busy preparing or doing some work on utilizing the outputs from the 1,500 plus assessments that we've done so far, essentially trying to identify protected area characteristics or traits that may speak to why certain protected areas are more vulnerable than others. So we're busy with that work at the moment. And I think what we might do is try to bring in recommendations that fit certain clusters of protected areas. So that's a work in progress. Yeah.
Thank you. That sounds good.
Yeah, I think that regarding the WWF side, what you have shared in the presentation is quite summarizing. But I think that for each location as well, it's kind of already compiling the main recommendation for the 263 protected areas. But for sure, for each protected area, I would say each study as well, more landscape or country level, we have specific recommendation. And this is kind of our next step, really, how we are going to implement that and to make sure that we are moving really to see how what is the I would say practical implementation of those adaptation measures for us. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both. Appreciate those responses.
Yes, absolutely. Gregor, I don't know, I hate to put you on the spot, but would you mind unmuting your mic and asking the question yourself?
Yeah. So the question to Harisoa and Kevin is just, if there isn't a compilation, is there perhaps a model management plan that is a good example of implementation of this CAMPA process? That would be really helpful.
So yeah, I would say that from the Madagascar cases, because one of the main outcomes of this process was really that having on board the revised management plan and tools. For sure, not really the perfect one, but at least we've tried really to see how it will be embedded. And that's really our next step as well, not to stop with what the project has done, but see it's something really that the park manager will include as part of their daily work in looking at climate change. And moving to Kombi question as well. I would say that because regarding protected areas, we have two cases. There are already existing protected areas that in general were not really designed with looking at climate risk and so on. And there is, I would say, new protected areas that has been set up that really an opportunity as well. So from our experiences, we can address that in both, like existing or new, but as said in the presentation, the first thing is really first to understand how climate risks are affecting your conservation target in your protected areas as well as people living around. But it needs really some capacity building, particularly from the manager, because they have really need to shift even their way of managing their protected areas and integrating as part of their overall management. So I think that really starting by understanding this level of an habitat assessment is key. That's I can say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Patty, you had your hand raised. Would you like to ask your question?
Melanie, yes. First of all, thank you very much to the presenters. I'm Paddy Gordon. I have managed 6 national parks in South Africa, and I've been doing this for 33 years. So I've seen all of these things. This is all great music to my ears. So I have a very unfair question. South African national parks at the moment are very much in a compliance phase. You know, we have climate change vulnerability studies as a compliance thing. We have to do them. We've got park management plans for each national park. We write them because it's a compliance thing. But our governance still, I don't think, has cottoned onto the fact that parks cannot be managed as static systems to keep things as they are. They're going to have to be managed towards climate change, maybe the RAD model, maybe some of the other things that we've heard. So the unfair question to Gregor, thank you very much for those models, is how do we communicate upwards to our governance, to our senior management, that the compliance models of just getting these done and the checklist is now outdated, and that we need to start designing management plans for this climate change, to build in scenario planning, for example, to come up with which options are suitable for which national park. I have now managed national parks in arid areas, coastal areas, and now I'm very much inland, and they all have different responses to climate change. All of them have different threats, but they definitely have threats. And I'm worried that we are now being given these tools as protected area managers, but our governance structures above us are still not ready for this type of thing. I know that's a very big unfair question, Gregor, but I would love to hear what you have to say about it. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Patty. It is a bit of an unfair question in the sense that I'm not the only person, I think, who can speak to that. And so, at least from the American side, after I say my little bit, I'd encourage Joel or our program lead, Kat, if she's on, to maybe offer a thought there as well. What I will say is that, first off, among managers and people in resource management, there's a spectrum of who gets it because maybe they've been managing a place where they're right at the tip of the spear of these issues versus people in places that maybe are less vulnerable and a little late to this conversation. So there's already a spectrum within our own community. We shouldn't be surprised that those one step away or even more than one step away should be even less aware of the breakdown of the historical management paradigm and the need to think differently. So this is all understandable, but also has to be dealt with, as you say, Patty. And so how do we do that? And most of us, our job day to day is just helping our managers solve their problems. So this is sort of a side job of communicating upward rather than sideways. And what we've done in the Park Service and in the Department of Interior in which we sit is, I think, try to work up our rungs from where we are and find those opportunities. Try to highlight management units that are very forward-looking and deliberate and clear about their use of the RAD framework or whatever framework they're finding acceptable, and really more just communicating a recognition of non-stationarity. So we've got a couple of parks close to DC that happen to be good at this, and we've seen, one of the slides I was going to show was of a US congressman articulating the challenges of non-stationarity based on having visited that park. So it's about helping people experience this. And in that case, that's in-person visits by elected leaders, maybe not specifically about ecosystem transformation, but that's what they're learning when they go to a flagship park and they want to learn about what management in a climate change context in today's environment is all about. The one other thing I'll say, that in addition to kind of just trying to use our showpiece parks and managers and approaches to drive the discussion, we've also tried to get in the media to a degree, and that's been quite effective. Just try to generate stories about new things happening. And then the final piece I'll say is sort of the more traditional approach is working up our own chain. We've worked hard to get recognition of ecological non-stationarity and tools available inserted into updates to our top of the chain guidance, which is the DOI Climate Change Handbook, Department of Interior Climate Change Handbook, that came out in the past year and is sort of a product of Biden administration initiatives. So we found that opportunity, and we made sure that we had this discussion highlighted in there as a cue to managers and others that there's a need to think differently, and that allows managers to point to that and say, I'm being consistent with high-level guidance as part of a paradigm shift. Those aren't easy things to do, and they're a little different than what we spend most of our time doing, but that's what we've done.
Patty, I would add one other bit that Gregor mentioned in passing in his presentation, but he mentioned this federal work group on navigating ecological transformation that, you know, is one of sort of the home bases in development of RAD. And part of the intention of that was realizing this isn't just an issue for the National Park Service. It's not just an issue for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It's not just an issue for Bureau of Land Management, that all these land and resource management agencies in the federal system all need to be on the same page in terms of acknowledging the scale and scope of the problem, and ideally in coming up with a framework that they could all be on the same, sort of singing from the same musical score and addressing. And so I think the work that went into pooling all those agencies together so that there was a unified voice around this framework, even though it's mid-level managers and researchers doing that has lended a lot of credence and impact to the RAD framework coming out of that group. And so you made sure that you had key voices across agencies to then sort of generate pressure, as Gregor just mentioned, at the higher levels of the Department of Interior on that as well. And I'll stop because Kat was the one who was essential in all of this, so she can clarify or correct. So.
No, I'll only add one thing if folks can hear me. I think everything that Gregor offered and Joel just said is part of the groundswell that has brought great recognition, I think, across bureaus and the Department of Interior to the fact that we are dealing with transforming ecosystems and that stationarity and managing for existing conditions is not feasible. The only thing I would add, and first I should say I'm Kat Hawkins-Hoffman. I'm the lead of the Climate Change Response Program for the National Park System. The only thing I would add is that our former director also received a report from the Park Service has an advisory council or advisory committee that was quite active at the time in the previous administration. They had a science subcommittee that was commissioned to look at what the primary goals of natural resource management and cultural resource management should be in the National Park Service under changing conditions. And I think their report, which was called Revisiting Leopold, because it was an update to a report that came out in the 1960s to the Park Service, their report was instrumental in stating from a high level in that it was endorsed by at least our previous director, stating that the Park Service needs to manage for change that is not fully understood. So that really has started to create a culture shift. We don't have ensconced in our official management policies yet a statement for how we integrate that concept with our mission, which is to manage for unimpaired resources. I think Gregor illustrated some key passages from our management policies that said we manage for natural conditions. So we still haven't wrestled with how to bring that managing for change into language in our policies. We've made a few little exploratory statements in that arena, but it's not fully voiced yet in our policies. But I would say the culture of the Park Service has and is shifting to realize that that is the world we're in. So I don't think we're fighting a real uphill battle. It's mainly trying to figure out how we get our heads around it, how we articulate within our mission, how we will accommodate the reality that we are managing for change.
Okay, thank you, Kat. We are at time, so I will let you all go. But before I do, I would like to invite you, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you for the conversation. It was really just so well framed and informative. Next month, June 29th is the last Wednesday of the month. We will speak on restoration. Joel, if you want to share your slide to show the speakers, you can. I don't have mine up, but you will receive information about this in a follow-up email, along with the recordings, the resources that have been shared here today, and an invitation to register for next month and for the rest of the series. So we hope to see you again. Thank you very much for joining, and have a wonderful morning or evening, depending on where you're at.
Thanks.
Everyone.
Bye.